partners, and colleagues. Thank you, Gab. Good morning, partners and colleagues. I hope that everyone has been keeping safe and healthy and well. Welcome to Green the Bank's Accelerating ESG in Green Banking, a regional cross-market lesson-sharing dialogue between Vietnam and the Philippines. My name is Tung Ho. I am the Clean Energy Manager for Allotrope Partners and also the Program Manager for Green the Bank's Vietnam. I am honored to host and moderate today's timely webinar to learn more about green banking across Vietnam and the Philippines, and with a special attention to the acceleration of ESG integration in the region. So next slide, please. You can see the agenda for today. So we will begin today's program with some quick context setting slides, to be then followed by a presentation on ESG integration in Philippines banking system from Assistant Governor Lin R. Javier. We will then hear from Associate Professor Nhung Do from the National Economics University on her latest research on the level of development in green banking using empirical results and discussions. We will then continue our webinar with a panel discussion on ESG practice in the banking sector across ASEAN, Philippines, and Vietnam, where panelists will explore the regional perspective, country-level policies, ESG banks practices, and future recommendation for the sector. Please feel free to send in your questions in the Q&A box at any point in the program. We will be more than happy to answer your questions. Next slide, please. A quick recap for our attendees. Green the Banks, or GTB, is led by Allotrope Partners, a clean energy advisory firm in the United States, with ground staff across Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. Green the Banks was launched in Philippines in 2019, seeking to build the capacity of public and private sector financial institutions to actively participate in green finance. Through Green the Banks, we are engaging with different stakeholders to bridge the gaps among banks, regulators, and civil society organizations to unlock scale investments in the region by facilitating cross-country dialogues among stakeholders. Next slide, please. So after the successful launch of Green the Banks Vietnam in April with Vietnam Banks Association, our team in Vietnam seeks to facilitate more interactive trainings and information exchange sessions with local and regional banks active in Vietnam, with other stakeholders in the country as well. These capacity building dialogues will bring together expert speakers and network participants, where today on July 7th, our first dialogue will focus on the topic of ESG accelerations, while the second dialogue planned for July 21st will emphasize on green social sustainability and sustainability-linked instruments. Next slide, please. With this, we not to keep you any longer, we now proceed to the main program with firstly the presentation of our resource speakers, starting with Assistant Governor Lin Xavier, whom if allowed, I may warmly address as AG Lin. Ms. Xavier is the Assistant Governor of the Policy and Specialized Supervision subsector under the Financial Supervision sector of Bangko Sentral Pilipinas, or BSP. She oversees the supervisory policies and data departments of BSP, as well as the supervision of the multiple specialized areas. Ms. Xavier is also the designated BSD representative to the Basel Consultative Group, the executive meeting of East Asia Pacific Central Banks Working Group on Banking Supervision. At the domestic level, Ms. Xavier is involved in the interagency committees and working groups related to the supervision of financial institutions and promotion of sustainability agenda. So without further ado, let's give a round of virtual applause to AG Lin. And Ms. AG Lin, the virtual applause is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tang Ho. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas to be part of this webinar. We are privileged to actually share our approach and practices with you. It's not perfect. We have to continuously enhance and improve our approach and strategies. And we're happy to also hear insights from your end on how we could move this agenda forward. It's actually no secret that the Philippines has been identified as among the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of natural disasters and climate change. We have seen how extreme weather episodes could cripple operations of affected banks, particularly those in the region. So it does not take a lot of convincing for BSP to recognize that ESG-related risks pose significant threats to financial stability. Next slide, please. Now, for this morning, I would share the broad strategies of the Bangko Sentral in integrating ESG principles in the financial sector. Our strategies could be summed up into 3 high-level objectives. We aim to provide an enabling regulatory environment for our supervised financial institutions. That's the first one. Second, we also strive to align our policies, approaches, and initiatives with national strategies and aspirations. And third, this is an aspiration of the Bangko Sentral. We wanted to lead also by example. Next slide, please. So in promoting an enabling regulatory environment, we considered 2 important factors. First, the landscape of the Philippine banking system. The Philippine banking system is characterized by having large banks that are part of conglomerates and the smaller community banks in the regions. The second is that the BSP and its supervisors, we are not climate scientists. So we also need to build our capacity as regulators in introducing ESG principles in the financial sector. So it's important for the first factor that the sizes of banks vary in the financial sector. It is important that in issuing ESG regulations, we adhere to the principle of proportionality. There's no one-size-fits-all framework for this, similar to other risk management guidelines that we have issued. The adoption of the framework and adoption of policies, practices, and systems related to ESG should be commensurate to the size, risk profile, and complexity of operations of banks and financial institutions. Now, on the second point, that we also need to build our own capacity as regulators. We thought it would be best to adopt a phased approach in issuing regulations. This, as we also see how the practices, international practices in embedding sustainability principles in regulatory frameworks evolve. And so in April 2020, at the height of the implementation of COVID-19 related mobility restrictions, the BSP issued the Sustainable Finance Framework. It provides a foundation in embedding sustainability principles in regulatory framework. That issuance focused on 3 key elements. First, corporate governance and highlighting our expectations and responsibilities of the board of directors. This is us telling our supervised financial institutions that the tone of embedding ESG principles should come from the top. Second, we expect adoption of effective risk management systems. And third, disclosure requirements for stakeholders. Following this, the BSP released its Environmental and Social Risk Management Framework in October 2021, which provides the guidelines in considering environment and social risks in the bank's credit and operational risk management system. Now, reading through that circular issuance, you'd see that we do not expect an overnight change from our supervised financial institutions. In fact, there's a language there stating that we expect banks to progressively increase their exposures to sustainable investments and projects. Change would not happen overnight. We have to gradually transition also to our goal of net zero, considering the economic status of the Philippines, as well as the industry supporting the Philippine economy. Now, the BSP will soon issue guidelines on the integration of sustainability principles in the investment management of banks. That issuance aims to shape investment decisions of banks such that they do not fund sectors or activities that pose significant harm to the environment and society. I remember one publication, carbon bank crawling, that was published, that a lot of investments, also of companies in banks, would shape also or help accelerate the transition to net zero if investors and the public would just be sensitive in terms of putting their money in institutions that have embraced the sustainability agenda. Now, that issuance on investment management activities, which we target to issue by this month or early next month, will be followed by an issuance on the guidelines on stress testing activities of banks. The stress testing guidelines will be informed by our learnings from the current pilot stress testing exercises that we are doing with volunteer big banks through the support of the World Bank. So we are, for the smaller banks, because I've also shared a while ago about the landscape of the Philippine banking system, we are conducting a vulnerability assessment, highlighting natural hazards and their impact on the loan portfolio of volunteer thrift and rural banks. So the different exercises that we've targeted for the big banks and the small banks illustrate how we also apply the principle of proportionality in terms of understanding the risk exposures of our supervised financial institutions to ESG related risks. These exercises, we hope and we are confident, will help deepen the BSP and the banking sector's understanding of our exposures to climate, physical, and transition risks. Results and lessons learned will feed into the bank's risk management practices and enhancement of the BSP surveillance and risk analysis system. Now, to further promote sustainable finance, the BSP supports the amendments to the Agri-Agra law, or the Agriculture and Agrarian Reform Law. That law actually mandates our banks to set aside 25% of their loanable funds, or increase in their loanable funds, to the agricultural sector. So in the amendments to that law, we have proposed to also consider sustainable investments, projects, and lending as eligible compliance with the mandatory requirement. Next slide, please. Now, on the second high-level objective, we aim to align our policies and approaches with the national strategies and aspirations. The BSP recognizes that a whole-of-nation approach is essential to address climate change and promote sustainable development. So it is in this light that we also aim to align to the greatest extent possible to the national government strategies and aspirations in setting out our groundwork for sustainable finance. One of the most important milestones in this respect is the development of the Philippine Sustainable Finance Roadmap and Guiding Principles, which were both launched in October 2021. So these are two separate documents. These documents are products of the collaboration of key government agencies, all committed to pursue the sustainability agenda. The roadmap sets out the strategies to accelerate sustainable financing in the country. Meanwhile, the guiding principles establishes a common platform or understanding on what economic activities are considered as sustainable. The roadmap actually created pathways for collaboration between and among agencies. Now, these include the creation of the Technical Working Group on Sustainable Finance, composed of financial sector supervisors. I'm talking about the BSP, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Insurance Commission, under the auspices of the Financial Sector Forum. The Financial Sector Forum is actually an interagency body comprised of regulators in the financial sector, where cross-cutting issues in the financial industry are discussed, and where the principals agree in issuing common regulations covering specific issues across the financial sector. Now, that technical working group is working on harmonizing regulations on corporate governance, disclosure, and risk management within the context of sustainable finance. Now, we do expect that with the issuance of common standards and regulations across the financial sector. We'll have seamless actions and implementation of initiatives pursuing the sustainability agenda. The technical working group also is also tasked to develop sustainable finance taxonomy and ESG product standards to support stakeholders in making financing and investment decisions. The work of the technical working group on the taxonomy will be informed by the ASEAN Taxonomy version 1. The BSP participated in the development of the ASEAN Taxonomy version 1, as well as in crafting the report on the roles of ASEAN central banks in managing climate and environment-related risks that was published in November 2020. Next slide, please. Now, the third high-level objective is for the BSP. The BSP also aspires to lead by example in adopting sustainable principles and practices. In 2019, the BSP launched the Sustainable Central Banking Program as one of our strategic thrusts. In line with this, we will soon be issuing our 11-point strategy, embodying our role as enabler, mobilizer, and doer in championing the sustainability agenda in the financial system. So on top of the issuance of enabling regulations in the banking system, now I already shared a role as enabler when I discussed or shared with you the regulations and the approach that we adopted in the financial sector. We also have early accomplishments in other areas of operations and functions of the BSP. Now, currently, the BSP is looking at our practices to incorporate climate risks in monetary policy activities. Just last month, the BSP published our economic newsletter, providing our preliminary thoughts on the interaction of climate change and monetary policy. In terms of reserve management, the BSP invested a total of $550 million in the Green Bond Fund managed by the Bank for International Settlements, as well as the Asian Green Bond Fund. For building management, the BSP is set to build the new BSP complex that is envisioned to become a global benchmark for a smart, green, and modern facility that promotes environmental sustainability and efficiency. We have also completed our vulnerability assessment study, which looked at the impacts of natural disasters to BSP offices and branches in the region. The results of this study will be considered in enhancing the BSP's risk management framework. Alongside all this, we are continuously strengthening our digitalization program to promote the reduced paper usage within the bank and adoption of cost-efficient resource management. Next slide, please. Now, while we have started the groundwork in promoting sustainable finance, we continue to face challenges. Broadly speaking, the challenges may be categorized into three. First, lack of awareness and insufficient understanding, both of the industry and the supervisors as well. Second, inadequate tools to manage ESG-related risks. And third, unavailability of data. These challenges are described on this slide, and if you would allow me to walk through that briefly, these points briefly. Minimal or lack of necessary technical skills and expertise and tools to implement the sustainable finance framework. Second, limited knowledge on assessing material E&S risks and translating the same into meaningful information for purposes of determining our financial soundness indicators, as well as collateral valuation, loan pricing, and other technical operations and analysis. We have limited availability of quality ESG data and data gathering tools to support the metrics, target setting, and recalibration of bank operations consistent with sustainability standards. The lack of parameters and indicators to assess and identify whether sectors or investment activities are sustainable, and also the limited knowledge and capabilities to develop viable, sustainable financial products that are in line with the risk appetite and business model of the bank. And the list goes on. But in addressing these challenges, we should leverage on existing partnerships and collaborative engagements with development partners like Greening the Bank and Allotrope. as well as our counterpart regulators in other jurisdictions who are well ahead of us in this space. So we do not have to invent the wheel. We could just learn from their experiences. Now, this point just highlights the importance of actively participating in regional and international groups and networks and dialogues in promoting the sustainability agenda. I'll pause here and thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for your sharing, Ajilin, and especially on the kind of history with the sustainable finance kind of framework from till now and the roadmap ahead. We would like to go more in depth on your sharing about the 11-point strategy and also the challenges that you may face later in the panel discussion. So just to move on to the next presentation, now we'd like to introduce the next speaker, who is Associate Professor Nhung Do, who is currently an Associate Professor of Finance and Banking School at the National Economics University and an esteemed member of the research group on the development of green banking and green investment. Her research focused on the promotion of commercial banks' participation in sustainable development. And following Ajilin's amazing presentation on the Philippine side, perhaps Professor Nhung can shed some light on the current state of banking in Vietnam. Thank you, and a round of applause to Professor Nhung, and the virtual floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Right. I appreciate to very happy to join in discussion about the green banking. Right. So my research group focus on the green banking and green investment for I think for 10 years ago. Right. So this today I share some results of the green investment level development levels in Vietnam. So I am very attractive about the urges in Philippines of Professor Lin, right? Now I have some information about the developments of green bank in Vietnam. I'm Nhung Do from the National Economic University, right? Some information focused on objective. Recent objective to develop green bank in Vietnam, and the methodology to regressions determinant factor effects on the green banks developments in Vietnam, especially some discussion and empiricals and the recommendations about the government's business and commercial bank. So this, as you know, in the context of Vietnam, have some government policy, right, to achieve objective in green development projects. Vietnam will be lead to about $30 billion US. Right, so most Vietnam business firm on where to approach capital offers firm based on credits from the commercial bank, especially some commercial bank grants are loan for the almost project. So this in the Vietnamese government have a policy and the choices on the green growth for periods of 2011 and 2020 up to 2015. Green finance and green banking actually a part of the green economy, especially is the green in recent year, right? Green investment related green bank, right? Special focus on the government policy. So this is my research, our research for have some the capital requirement for the units that value added based three sector. Those the first sector is the total the first sector about 9% with the capital requires one added unit added value, and the section 2 and the sector 3. But this is our research to take surveys on the 2016. But this is implications of priority sector in the green credits in Vietnam as a specified 10 sector, bio sector. So this is, you can see on my slide, we have some of file the 10 sector to improving and the priority sector in the green credit in Vietnam, and as well as 10 sector have a lot of the green project in Vietnam. So this as you know, the green bank have some definition provided by international organization. So this in green bank is a normal bank that supports a service for investor and the customer, also the enforcer program supports the environment. So, and other definition focus on the green bank with the core activity along with the improvement of the environment. So, and others is focus on the own social and ecological factor to protect environment and take CSR in business. Right. So in this research, we have based on the developed levels of green bank by Koffler. So this is by Koffler have 5 level development of the green bank, right? So first level is a very easy, and the first step to unefforted corporate activity to boost own activity of the firm. And then is level 2 is isolated activity practice. And so this is in the time during Paris, we take observations. Right, so some commerce bank, in Vietnam is a level 3. It's a domestic business activity. But this in this survey in this survey 3 months ago, right, on the 2022, we have filed the commercial bank move to level 2 is a strategic ecosystem innovation, and the last one is the top developed level is international economic innovation. So this is in the commercial bank in Vietnam, right? We based on the level 3 and the level 4 is a incorporate ecosystem innovations and the systematic business practice, right? So we have take research based on the 3 failure, right? So it's divide the 6 factor. But this is we have a true group. Is the first group is a macroeconomy, and the second group is a microeconomy. But if for the microeconomy, focus on the business activity of the firm, and the microeconomy, for example, government policy, right? Government support policy, and the banks, bank leader awareness, and the business performance of the bank and the other macroeconomy in Vietnam. So we have measured and take for 6 factor group. You can see on my slide where we have take the surveys on the 2018 to determine the factor of developed level based on the Koffler 5 level of the green banking in Vietnam. So this year, the results of the development levels of green banking in Vietnam is focused on the level 3. So this you can see. So we have almost commerce bank in Vietnam have performance have the activity with the CSR. But this you have a little bit activity. So and I we have a surveys for the Environment Ministry in Japan, right? To take surveys in Vietnam, right? So this is some commercial bank in Vietnam move to level 4, incorporate with the innovation, right? So this in the survey take surveys in the 2022, right? So it's some factor in green bank development in Vietnam. We have to find out some determinant. You can see on my slide, we have the firm demand for the green development is a high portion. But this is almost projects of the firm, right, requirements, the capital from the bank, right? And then the bank agrees about the green bank and the tech performance business activity along with the green bank, especially we have some a little bit activity. So it's the role of the government to make a policy, right? Actually, very, very important. We have a government policy, so the green business, right, and green project, as well as is enough legal framework, right, to improving the green bank in Vietnam. So we have some factor for employee and the bank managers and the green investment and the green government policy. So this in up to now we have a take projects on green investment. So this is incorporate with VCCI in Vietnam to take some project to find out the determinants factor to affect business activity of the firm to invest in the green projects in Vietnam. So, for example, the green energy in building energy, right? So it's some other project, green project. Based on the determinant results, we have some recommendations about the government's policy and the firm and the commercial bank. But these almost recommendations about the awareness of the green bank, right? It's a 5 hours activity focused on the green bank in Vietnam. So we have applied the bottom-up approach model. A bottom-up from the first of the bottom-up approach model is business, right? Is a business. If the firm take to invest in the green project, then they requires a green capital from the commercial bank, and then green commercial bank, right, make a loan for the firm, apply the government policy. So this is a bottom-up approach model, right, from the business. And then is the government and the state bank in ministries of finance develops the treasury and the government policy to promote the development, green credit and green investment, as well as in the in during time in Vietnam, right? So select number of large financial institution is balanced the green investment model, right? And then replicate. So this is on our research in 2022 for the environment ministries of Japan. We have a tech survey for large commercial, for example, the VCB and BIDV and Vietinbank and the MB Bank, right? So it's a fire that is the 4 commerce bank in Vietnam have a separate department, right? To focus on the green energy and some green project to do business in Vietnam, right? So it's the last one is a select numbers of green investment field and projects balance and the replace. So this is in now up to now in Vietnam, we are with the Vietnamese government, right? Policy focus on the green energy and building energy and like other projects like that. For commercial bank in Vietnam, right? So bank actively to develop the treasury and the green banking and improve the qualifications of the staff to develop the green credits, right? And improving the bank leader awareness about the green investment project, right? And then to grant green credit for the green project. Green credit, for the green credit, need to communicate clearly and specific from the commercial bank and the business, right? And choose priority sector in green investment activity, as well as the special action to improve the green project in Vietnam, right? And then use to improve the awareness business leader about the green finance, right? And then use the business, right? Leader have a lot of chance to do business, but this they choose the green finance, right, and green project to protect the environment and take CSR in Vietnam for short term and so for long term, right? So this we have last but not least about this focus on the awareness of the bank leader and the staff qualifications and the awareness of the business leader and the the government make some government policy to push the develop the green economy specific specialized in the green bank and the green investment in Vietnam. Right. I have some information and briefing the results of our research in green banks in Vietnam. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation of the research, Professor Nhung. And I was surprised to hear that most of the banks in Vietnam are now at level 3. I'm not sure if we have a very similar studies conducted in the Philippines, but no matter where we are, I think we all will strive to target level 5 under the COLA rating and ranking for both countries eventually. And hopefully we can dig a little bit deeper into that topic after during the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Professor. So just a little bit before we move on to the panel, I think we are good on time at the moment. Just to go to the chat box, I do see some questions on the sharing of the slides today. So as my colleagues have shared, upon the approval from the speakers, we will be sharing the slides and also this the recording of this event, as well as a summary of the findings that we have from the events for your review afterwards within the next few weeks. So looking forward to that. Moving on to the panel discussions, we had 2 amazing presentations from A.G. Lin and from Professor Nhung. And for this panel discussion, we would like to welcome back both of you for this. And also I'd like to take the time to introduce some of the panelists on our panel here today. So firstly, I'd like to warmly welcome Mr. Eugene Wong, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. Hi, Gab, can you, I think there's some background noise from Van Le. Can you mute the panelist for now? Okay, perfect. Sorry for that. So he is the Executive CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, an independent institute established to catalyze ideas on sustainable finance at the policy level in Asia, and particularly in ASEAN, as well as to propel action in support of those policy ideas. And Mr. Eugene was previously the Managing Director of the Corporate Finance and Investment of the Securities Commission Malaysia, or SC. We should also note that the ASEAN Taxonomy Board is currently being hosted by the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia as well. So hopefully we can dig into that a little bit in our further discussion. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Ms. Van Le, who's a credit risk specialist from AB Bank in Vietnam. She has years of experience in the fields of environmental and social and sustainability management of project and corporate risk. And with a focus on credit risk management, she has provided technical expertise in impact assessment and international best practices for AB Bank throughout its lending assessment and management process. And last but not least, I'd like to warmly welcome Ms. Jean Nicole Nazares, or whom I may warmly address as Nikki. She is the Senior AVP and Head of Sustainability from Security Bank. So those are the 5 panelists for today. Let's give them a virtual round of applause before we start the sessions. And through the session today, we hope that we can help to explore options on how countries and the financial sector can approach ESG in a holistic fashion when embedding it into a management frameworks. And we do recognize that there are challenges linked to the integration of ESG risk into our strategies, governance, and risk management arrangements, especially as the development in this space is still evolving over time. So firstly, I'd like to kind of get our feet wet with a more regional overview of the sustainable finance status. And perhaps I can start with Mr. Eugene with the question, in terms of sustainable finance, how would ASEAN, the region, compare with other regions in Asia? And what are some of the exemplary nations when it comes to sustainable finance? Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Tung. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to speak to a group of people who are going to be catalysts in this journey that we're undertaking for sustainability right now. You asked a very interesting question. I don't think we can make a direct comparison as every country is really in a different situation. So if we compare regionally, ASEAN's not the EU. And certainly, from a political perspective, we're not the EU. From an economic perspective, we're not the EU. And even within ASEAN, there's a lot of diversity. So let's look at, for example, GDP. So our highest GDP per capita is 58,000. Our lowest is 1,002. Our average is about 4,005 in terms of US dollars. But in Europe, it's about 35,000. So we can't make a direct comparison because the situations are very, very different. Everyone has a different starting point, different resources, and so different socioeconomic situations. But I think it's important to look at how every country is trying to meet the sustainability agenda and to compare this against the timing of their target and the target itself. So policy-wise, on a larger basis, we need to look at whether countries have any form of plans. Do they have a net zero plan? So in ASEAN, 7 countries have a net zero plan. We need to look at whether they have national roadmaps. AG Lin mentioned about the Philippines sustainable finance roadmap. I think that's really, really important. We need to look whether they have green bond frameworks. So you see that Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore have green bond frameworks to enable this. We need to look at whether they're developing carbon pricing and carbon markets. We need to look at how they're integrating ESG into lending and investment practices. And you might note that Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia have all started to look at whether or not they can integrate this and how they're going to do it. And the central banks have actually issued guidance on it. And of course, do they make the right disclosures for people to allocate resources appropriately and hold those responsible for emissions and bad behavior out for scrutiny? So what's really important is something AG Lin mentioned just now, and that is the proportional approach. We need to be very proportional because, again, it comes back to the fact that all our countries have different starting points. And the one thing I want to point out that may be very different for ASEAN and many other regions in the world is the importance of transition. Because of the diversity that we have and the very low starting point some of our member states have, and the inadequate financial resources, we actually need to be able to have a very good transition pathway. And this is something ASEAN as a whole is also working on. And in fact, the ASEAN's taxonomy for sustainable finance is a transition taxonomy. It's meant to help with that. So you did ask me also about which exemplary nation we could follow. And again, I think my answer is that because of the different situations, we can't have an exemplary nation, but what we can have are the behaviors or the components that we really want, learning from other countries. So in my mind, the first thing is actually for us to be able to build a sustainable finance ecosystem. And for this, we need to be able to strengthen 3 pillars, that's taxonomy, transition pathways, and disclosure. And we need to push a lever for this, which is bringing together demand and supply, because you can have all the infrastructure and framework in place, but it's like throwing a party. You've got the ballroom, but if no one comes to dance, it's no use. So it's really getting that demand and supply started, which is really, really important.
Thank you so much for your sharing, Eugene. And I think to follow up a little bit on that, and perhaps this question is also follow up to Aigeline, I hope to hear your thoughts as well, that look at the transitions and the different kind of starting point with different countries in ASEAN. Do you think it's possible to define and actually implement a common strategy around the perhaps ESG integration into lending practices or others in terms of policies on ASEAN level? Or are we still restricted to development in silos in these countries?
This is a really, really interesting question. And you're asking at a time where DWS and Goldman Sachs are under investigation. So it's really, really relevant. ESG is really, really hard to define. And if you look at the credit rating agencies, you'll find a correlation of around 0.9 between the credit ratings. But if you go back to the ESG rating agencies, the correlations fall to about 0.4. And why is this the case? There is no universal definition for ESG. So if you take what an ESG rating agency is trying to do, first it's trying to define ESG, and everyone's got a different definition, right? How much do you weight the E, how much do you weight the S, and how much do you weight the G? And within the ESG components themselves, how do you weight each of the factors? The second is really then what sort of weighting do you give them? So let's take gender diversity, for example, right? Everyone says, oh, gender diversity is a big thing. How do you measure it? Is it women on the board, women in senior management, or is it percentage of women in the workforce, or is it the pay gap? And once you put all these factors together in a single number, the sky's the limit. I mean, you can have an infinite number of combinations. And this is why it's really, really hard to use a rating agencies to actually figure out one particular direction. So it is very challenging. And I think this is an issue that's still under consideration. If you want, I can also share a bit about what's happened in the EU, because in the EU, they have looked at how to integrate ESG factors into lending practices. And I know that many of our member states also are trying to do that. So the question is that, how do we do this? Because we know clearly that we have to do this, but how do we get to do this right? Now, I think ESG as a whole, so we don't have a definition as a whole, and it's really, really hard to define this for the region. I think what we'll have is that we'll have development of ESG pathways for every of our member states. They won't be in silos because there'll be a huge intersect between the areas they're looking at. For example, if you look at the E, emissions is something everyone's going to look at. Water usage, waste treatment. If you look at the S, of course, everyone's going to be concerned about labor practices and social treatment. So there'll be a huge intersect, and I don't think that it will be in isolation. But what we will have is, how do we have consistency and how do we interpret the data? I think that's important. I also wanted to add that I think ESG is very behavioral. So we need to do things like have more disclosure, and we need to also link it to remuneration of those who are allocating our resources, meaning senior management.
Thank you so much for sharing. And certainly, I do certainly agree that this is a very complex process, and with all the context events that's going on around. So perhaps I'd like to, if Aigeline, if you're still there, can I hear your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I think I would just like to echo what Eugene mentioned. It's quite difficult to standardize everything considering the different economic status and the different states of the countries in the ASEAN. What we could do, I think what they did with the ASEAN taxonomy version 1, it's quite brilliant because it considers actually the complexity and the nuances in the different jurisdictions. Any standard approach or what do you call this principle that should be adopted in the region should provide each jurisdiction adequate flexibility to tweak it to domestic conditions and to consider also unique conditions in the economy. I'm saying, for instance, the adoption of the taxonomy. For the taxonomy, at least I think it's common in the ASEAN and also in the Philippines that our economy is supported by the micro, small, and medium enterprises. So if we adopt a very stringent taxonomy at this point, we could be sacrificing a lot in terms of growth and recovery strategies for the economy. So we have to strike a critical balance in terms of pursuing ESG goals and achieving that net zero commitment, as well as ensuring a sustainable recovery and growth also for the country.
Thank you so much for sharing. And for this topic, I think we are kind of treading on the different metrics in the E, S, and the G. So what I like to do during panel discussion is to have a bullet rounds where I have quick questions to everyone, and you can answer in one sentence. So my question is that which do you think is, oops,
em cứ lấy đi, tại vì chưa có
here's some
ngân hàng nhà nước
background
chưa có
noise from
chưa gửi công
panelists. Okay, no worries. Okay. We're good to go. So my quick question to all of you is that which is the primary ESG matrix, E or S or G, for the banking sector in ASEAN should place a greater emphasis on? I know it's a tricky one, but it's a quick question to answer in one sentence. Eugene, you first.
I think it's really hard to do that because then you'd be engaging moral mathematics. So you probably have to look at all of them together, and you need a decision tree for this.
Okay, that's fair. Eugenie?
They are actually equally important, but when we started in the banking sector, we introduced already governance reforms and looking at the drive towards adopting sustainability principles. It puts also emphasis and greater weight, more weight as well to the E and S, as we also introduce it in the financial sector.
Thank you. Nikki, do you have any thoughts on which aspect of E and G the bank is focusing on?
I think I would just echo Mr. Wong and Ms. Javier here that it is a tricky question. I think you do have to take all three together, but for us also as a bank, especially being early in the ESG journey, I think it was very important to establish governance first, and really having that line of, I guess, oversight to be able to establish the proper E and S practices as well. So having that as a good foundation was important.
Thank you so much for sharing. Professor Nyung, your thoughts on this as well, ESG. You're on mute, Professor.
Yes, so I think that last week we joined in the conference zero carbon market, right? So I think is moved to levels if goes to the zero carbon market and just establish the market to emissions ecology of the leading to is erosions in the zero carbon. So I think that's is a focus, right? And
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Like for Ms. Funle, I think I'd like to move to my mother tongue to better communicate with her right now. Chị Vân, không biết chị còn ở đó không? No worries. I think just now she had something going on in the background, so perhaps you can return to Ms. Vân a little bit after. So thank you so much for sharing through these bullet points. I know it's a tricky question, but it's kind of a fun exercise to get everyone involved for the panel discussion. And I'd like to take this chance to also thank Mr. Eugene. I was informed that Eugene has a very full schedule today, but he still make the time to provide us the regional context for our discussion moving forward. And he will have to leave earlier at 10. So we are deeply grateful for your insights so far, and hopefully we can engage you on another occasion. You still have 5 minutes left. So before you leave, I'd like to leave you with the last question on this regional section. What do you think on the future of ESG related policies and strategies for ASEAN, and recommendations that you can make for now? Yeah.
You're ending with a very important and good question. Well, firstly, I think for our ESG journey in Southeast Asia, we have to understand that perfect is not good enough anymore. So if we're going to wait for something perfect before we do something, it's not going to be useful to us. So we should do whatever we can now. This means that we have to undertake a transition journey. It's important to build the ecosystem. So in the short term, I really think what we should do is to ensure that our 3 pillars are up. And again, I mentioned just now the taxonomy, the transition pathway, and disclosures. And we do need all of this to be regional. We need it to be regional because ASEAN is a bloc. We may not be a political bloc like the EU, but we still are a bloc, and we're an asset class. So if we're going to attract the capital internationally and within the region, we should have that consistent. In the medium term, I think what we really need to do is to actually start to get the demand and supply interacting to move capital into the real economy, and for the real economy to demand the capital with the right criteria. So essentially what we have is a mutually reinforcing virtuous cycle. And in the longer term, I actually think that sustainable finance should no longer exist. And why do I say that? Because in the longer term, every bit of financing we do should be actually towards something sustainable. So this should be our sustainability journey in the longer term. And I also did want to say that I know banks will find it very difficult to start integrating ESG components into their work. It's not just about getting the data. It's really about getting the data, how you get it, how you synthesize it, how you analyze it, and more importantly, what you do with it. So for example, if you say that, let's talk about a farm. If you want to finance a farm that alleviates poverty, but of course, naturally, it's going to add waste into the land, how do you resolve that? I mean, what's your moral mathematics? Is creating jobs, getting 5 points, and causing more pollution, deduction of 3 points? Do you look at the absolute increase in pollution, or do you look at the relative increase in pollution versus the number of, say, cows you have? So these are things banks need to start thinking about. And I think in the longer term, we also need to start ensuring that we have consistency across all the credit providers in the region. The last thing I also wanted to say is that apart from building the ecosystem, like I mentioned just now, we need to get together and build policy drivers, things like carbon pricing and markets, developing nature-based solutions, removing subsidies where they're not needed, providing subsidies where they're needed, including for transition assistance, having the right tax policies, and also pushing the right energy policies. And we need to facilitate this with things like de-risking mechanisms, as well as early retirement mechanisms for, say, coal plants.
Thank you so much for sharing, Eugene. I think that is, we will certainly be noting down of this recommendation and share that with our audience afterwards. And thank you again for today for joining our panel, offering your insight, not just on the region, but also on the different countries as well. So feel free to stay on until you can, but I think that really concludes our regional session of the panel discussion for today. And I will certainly leave this tough question on the future of the region for the other panelists afterwards at the end of our panel discussion. So do not worry about that. Thank you, Eugene, once again.
Thank you very much again.
Okay, so now we'll move on to a little bit of a discussion on the more country level policies and regulations and standardizations. This next question is for Professor Yung. And perhaps Ajilin to a certain extent, but Nikki and Ms. Van, do not worry. Certainly we have more questions lined up for you as well. So Ms. Professor Yung, I just want to ask, in terms of green banking level, right now we're at level 3. From most of the commercial banks at level 3 at the moment. And what do you think is segregating us from level 5 or perhaps from more advanced countries with green banking level at the moment? And what do you want us to do more in terms of ESG regulations and standards and policies?
It's a good attractive question, and I think if you want to move level 3, 4, and 5, right? So it's observations about the some factor based on the government policy, right? Our research group, right, take observations about the determining factor effects on the green investment, right, incorporate a green bank. So this years we have some a little bit some action to improve awareness about the green investment, right? So it's a green investment in Vietnam focused on the green energy sector, right? Is the other activity is very large of the activity. So but this year government policy have make on the some policy to set up the market, right? Is a market of with the ensure that to protect environment in Vietnam, especially the zero carbon market, right? And some market focus on the energy, for example, the building energy market, right? Incorporate with EVN in Vietnam, right? So, but this, when we observe some business, right, say that the government policy very difficult and make change from the cost of the energy, right, in this year and the next year. So it's not consistent. But this is more difficult to do business about this the green process. Right, so I think that in the allied with the green bank, right, and the green credit is allied with is the green process. So I think that if you commercial bank want to move to level 3 to level 4 in the incorporate innovation, right, as a priority sector. But not only the energy sector, right? So if I'm not sure say level 3 moves to level 5, right? So I think it lawmaker and some special policy and improving the awareness of the business and the household, right?
Thank you so much for sharing, and certainly there's a long way. There's some way to go between level 3 to level 5, and this question perhaps let me modify it a little bit because we have already seen the presentation, Jilin, on the kind of challenges in terms of ESG data, and also Eugene mentioned about the need for disclosure of the region. So what is still there to be done in terms of disclosure and ESG data standardization for the Philippines to do with its market? Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry, Tom. Hello, thank you for that question. In terms of disclosure, our Securities and Exchange Commission actually already prescribed disclosure requirements for publicly listed companies. So on the part of the Bangko Sentral, so as not to make it too onerous for the banks that we supervise, we leverage on those disclosure requirements and highlighted some other information that we need to disclose to the public, but we're not saying that we're stopping from that point. We are actually, through the technical working group, we will be aligning disclosure requirements across the financial sector. And we are looking at the potential issuance of the International Accounting Standards Board, the committee they created, aligning disclosure for sustainability, that would be adopted in the country. So once that's issued, that would be adopted also in the Philippines and across all companies or corporations. Now, having said that, disclosure should be accompanied by measurement metrics, and that's where we are all lacking. So, unfortunately, the current data that's being captured by the BSP is not designed to capture ESG-related risks. So, what we intend to do also through the support of development partners and our learnings from partnerships with other countries in other jurisdictions or regulators in other jurisdictions is to enhance also the data that we're capturing to also assist banks in terms of looking at all this information and being informed in making decisions and investments related to ESG.
Thank you so much for sharing on the kind of support that you seek to provide with the banks in the country. And I think it's a perfect time for me to move to the commercial banks aspect and to listen to them for what they want in terms of support. So my first question to Nikki, do you observe what do you observe as the kind of policies or regulation that you want to have more focus on in the future? In terms, would that be in terms of the disclosure and reporting standards, or in terms of the data standardization for ESG matrix? So feel free to share your thoughts, Nikki.
Sorry, Tengho, your question was what policies do we
want to see to have more incentives or policies in the near future, to better support the banks.
Thank you. Okay, I think maybe in that sense, to take a little bit of a step back and look at the current challenges that we have in implementing ESG and the sustainable finance framework. One of the first things that we actually really, had to work on was around the governance of sustainable finance. And, talking about sustainability, it really is, I guess, an entire organization process. So having to establish, the right definitions and the right taxonomy so that we would be able to appoint the right people to be accountable for certain things. The way that it is now, right? And I understand also from Ms. Javier that the central bank is doing everything it can to try and give the best guidance to banks. We're also still feeling that there are a lot of different standards and frameworks out there, and trying to align to best practices sometimes is very, very confusing. So the first thing would probably be not so much a policy, but a guidance on how we define specific ESG, products, services. Mr. Wong mentioned earlier about this transition pathway. So to see that as well would be like a good guidance for us to actually align ourselves better and organize ourselves better. Towards. So I understand also that's another thing that's being worked on. And I think the other thing is around disclosures. So right now, in the Philippines, I think the main sustainability disclosure that's being followed by most corporates and most publicly listed companies is GRI. And there are a few that have signed up to more advanced maybe disclosures like TCFD. But again, just looking at the requirements to be able to disclose to TCFD would require a lot as well of the data collection, I think, and that's also where banks such as ourselves are struggling. As Ms. Javier pointed out, the data that we currently capture does not capture ESG risk. So while on one hand, we know that we are in a race against time essentially, and we want to catch up as quickly as we can, but we also want to do things right. And to be able to do this, we need to set the right baselines, to be able to set a realistic ambition, realistic targets for either net zero or achieving the Paris Agreement goals. But to be able to do that, we need our baselines, and to get our baselines, there's quite a lot of information that we're also not able to procure as a bank. So while we can advocate for disclosure from our clients, it's not something we can easily demand as well. And even if we do have it, the systems also still need to be put in place within the bank to actually be able to capture and do the right kind of modeling, the right kind of assessments. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing very on the ground kind of challenges, because you are the one who are collecting the data and using that in your models for stress testing and all kind of different risk assessment methods. So we understand the kind of your sharing that you have. And I will now attempt to contact Ms. Vân again. We understand that there has been some technical challenges so far, but I'll do so again in Vietnamese. Chị Vân có nghe được em không ạ? Ms. Vân. Chị Vân đang on mute để em ask to unmute her.
Dạ, hello.
Chị Vân có nghe được em không ạ?
Dạ, em nghe nè.
Dạ.
Tại vì cái mạng của em nó hơi lắc á anh. Em không có rõ
Hơi
lắm
yếu.
á. Dạ. Hello.
Mình nghe được Vân ha. So I think I'll switch back to English. So can everyone hear Ivan? Just can you hear this Miss Vân? Ivan, can you hear her? It's a little softer.
A little soft, but yeah, we can hear her.
Dạ.
Okay, we'll do our best. Vân ơi, có một câu hỏi một chút về ESG nha. Thì hiện tại câu hỏi của mình là các ngân hàng của Việt Nam như là AB Bank có đang muốn có những cái chính sách hỗ trợ gì về ESG trong tương lai không? Ví dụ như là về thông tin hay là về các cái việc báo cáo thông tin trong về thị trường nói chung.
Hiện tại thì bên Allotrope thì cũng có một cái chính sách về cái quản lý khung môi trường rủi ro môi trường và xã hội, nhưng mà cái khó khăn của mình ở đây là nói chung là khó khăn trong cái việc là tìm kiếm chuyên gia hay là một cái chuyên viên gì mà hiểu biết về cái lĩnh vực môi trường xã hội, cho nên là với lại cái việc trong cái thời gian vừa qua thì dịch bệnh nữa, cho nên là Allotrope vẫn chưa tuyển được cái chuyên gia về cái lĩnh vực này để mà hướng dẫn các đơn vị kinh doanh cũng như là có thể có những cái chuyên môn để mà thẩm định môi trường xã hội một cách chính xác và phù hợp.
Cảm ơn rất nhiều về chia sẻ về sự cần thiết trong việc có những thêm chuyên gia và huấn luyện cho những cái người có khả năng để thực hiện các thủ tục cũng như là cái quy trình về ESG ha. So, mình sẽ quay trở lại nói chuyện với các panelist khác bằng tiếng Anh.
Chong, I think you were on mute.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. So thank you, Ms. Vân, for your sharing on capacity building needs. We have about 15 minutes left, so perhaps we will now move on from the policies and regulations section on to the kind of ESG best practices in the banking sector. And then we will leave about 5 minutes for final comments. Before we do that, there are some questions from the chat box, and I hope that some of the panelists here can answer this. The first question that we have is that, is there any banks in Vietnam a member of GFANZ or any scholar participating in the effort by ISSB Climate Risk Sustainability Accounting Standards? Perhaps I can direct this question to Professor Nhung if she has the answer. If not, that's okay. We try to collect the answer after the meeting. Professor Nhung, do you see the first question from Zapier?
Yeah, I can see these questions, right? I can see these questions about any banks in Vietnam member, right? Any scholar participate in the first, right? Climate risk. So this is our group. We some lecture and the experts focus on the climate change and the climate risk, right? So especially in the ESGs in Vietnam. But this I'm not sure about any banks in Vietnam join the I'm not sure in Vietnam join the JP, right? If you want context about a scholar participant in the climate risk, right? So please contact me, right? And I very happy introduce about the some lecture and research on the climate risk in Vietnam.
I hope that answered the audience questions. The next question is to perhaps Aisha. There's a question from Gwyneth. Or a significant portion of businesses in the Philippines are MSMEs. Is the BSP considering releasing guidelines that can be adopted for these borrowers who are not sophisticated in terms of ESG adoption?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The financial sector supervisors are actually sensitive to the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which actually support 60 provides employment also for, and I think 90% of the employment opportunities in the country. What we are trying to do is to develop a taxonomy that's also flexible enough and considers the plight of the MSMEs. We do understand that they would need support in terms of further understanding ESG considerations. And this is an area that we are trying to address and discuss in the interagency body that we call the Green Force. It's actually a very challenging to address this issue, considering that across the country we need capacity building and awareness building campaign. So this is a top of the priority and the agenda of discussion of the different government agencies in transitioning to net zero.
Thank you so much for your answer, June. So moving on to the ESG practices in the banking sector, my question to Nikki is that we kind of explore the topic of ESG importance. Can you share the kind of weighting that you have at the moment across these three metrics? And among these metrics, I'm sure that it will be broken down into smaller metrics as well. Are there any highlights of the different metrics under each of these ESGs that perhaps Security Bank is focusing on with their lending processes in Philippines? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Deng Ho. Actually, to be very honest, when we look at ESG, like I said earlier, we're still trying to get the baseline underway. So in that sense, there is no defined yet weightage for anything under ES or G. What we have done to get started on the journey is really to take a look at the various disclosures that we have, and possibly using information from, for example, our MSCI like ESG ratings, trying to see if there is any low-hanging fruit, in the sense that in terms of disclosure, was there anything we were scored against which could have easily been addressed by a clearer articulation of strategy or disclosure, but also looking at the various metrics that maybe MSCI or other ratings agencies would put out. Saying, for example, under E is, how much of environment, how much do you finance environmental impact, or how do you measure this? As mentioned before, this is not something traditionally that the bank models would have. So getting ourselves organized around, okay, how do we now categorize and classify the portfolio according to ESG principles? So using maybe the guiding principles of BSP as a first framework to check which industries we are supporting, and how do we actually assess, right, how much of our portfolio is towards sustainable finance, and how much is actually leaning more towards the brown, or the dirty industry. So it's really very basic for now, and looking at those, really getting ourselves organized around the data collection, because again, we have various data across different systems in the bank, and not, a lot is available, but not necessarily organized in a way that would allow us to make sustainability decisions yet.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'd like to ask the same question to Ms. Vân, if it's possible, in my mother tongue. Chị Vân có nghe được em không ạ?
Em đang nghe.
Chúng ta câu hỏi của hiện giờ là trong các chỉ số môi trường, xã hội và quản trị, hiện giờ AB Bank đang điều chỉnh các chỉ số này với cái tỷ lệ như thế nào trong cái khung đánh giá của mình khi một dự án hay là một doanh nghiệp? Được vậy.
Nói chung là bên ngân hàng mình vẫn chưa có cái khung đó đâu anh. Chỉ là đánh giá ban đầu, phân loại theo cái gọi là phân loại rủi ro theo ngành nghề. Lúc đầu phân loại theo ngành nghề, sau đó sẽ đánh giá dựa vào cái bảng khảo sát, những bảng câu hỏi rủi ro về kinh doanh vậy thôi, chứ còn cũng chưa có cái khung cụ thể là mức điểm là nhiêu. Mới ban đầu chỉ đánh giá rủi ro theo ngành nghề, và sau đó sẽ là đưa ra những cái bảng câu hỏi theo các phụ lục chi tiết như thế nào đó, thì đơn vị chỉ cần tiết vào đó thôi. Thì cái phân loại rủi ro ở bên em sẽ phân loại thành 3 loại, là A, B, C. Thì cái mức độ A sẽ là rủi ro cao, B là rủi ro thấp, C là B là rủi ro trung bình, C là rủi ro thấp anh. Vậy thôi, chứ cũng chưa có cái khung cụ thể như là bên đề cập.
Cảm ơn chị Vân đã chia sẻ.
Xin phép Tùng 1 phút chỗ này được không?
Yes, Professor Nhung, please.
Dạ. Chỗ này mình xin chia sẻ tiếng Việt cùng với chị Vân luôn ạ. Là trong cái khảo sát đây nhất của mình đối với của Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường Nhật thì có khảo sát chính bộ cái đánh giá về climate risk và ESG đối với các project của 4 cái ngân hàng Việt Nam. Thì trong đó hiện nay có Vietcombank và BIDV là 2 ngân hàng mà bắt đầu họ tách một cái department riêng để đánh giá, và có một cái gọi là gì nhỉ, mức độ xếp hạng tín nhiệm riêng đối với một số lĩnh vực được coi là priority sector, trong đó chủ yếu là energy, green energy. Thì họ cũng đã bắt đầu đưa ra cái tiêu chí để đánh giá và xếp hạng về cái mức độ gọi là rủi ro liên quan đến ESG và liên quan đến climate change đối với các cái dự án này. Tuy nhiên thì nó cũng chưa thành một cái department riêng, mà nhưng họ đã có một bộ phận riêng và có cái tiêu chí đánh giá riêng của cái việc đánh giá mức độ rủi ro liên quan đến những dự án mà tiếp cận tới tín dụng. Nhưng mà để nói rằng là có một cái bộ phận riêng để đánh giá về ESG thì họ cũng chưa có. Nhưng có brochure, có guidance để hướng dẫn, và có cái tiêu chí để đánh giá và đưa ra cái tiêu chí về các mức độ rủi ro để đưa ra cái gói cho vay chuyên biệt riêng đối với những dự án kiểu như này. Xin hết ạ.
Cảm ơn chia sẻ của giáo sư Nhung ạ. So I'd like to conclude the panel discussion here. And it's hard to believe we have 5 minutes left for the panel discussion, actually 3 minutes. So I am like halfway through my questions. So I'll leave the floors to perhaps the Philippines panelists for your sharing. My last question is, what do you see in the future of ESG in Philippines and also perhaps in Vietnam, and what would you think how that will evolve in the near future, and what is your recommendations for the market? HB, please, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think sustainability, ESG, I mean, climate change in itself is an existential issue. So we just have to find out our role to play in terms of contributing to achieve our net zero aspirations or goals. For the financial industry, it's not just a job for regulators, it's also a job for the banking industry as well as the public. We have to be well informed on how we could contribute to driving investments and driving the behavior to sustainable practices and policies. So just to cut my message short, I mean, we are all accountable to ensure that the children or the youth would still have a world to live on and enjoy it the way we enjoyed it during our life. So I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any last thoughts on this also, Nikki?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add maybe to Ms. Javier's statement is I do believe that financial industry and banks in particular have a big role to play in enabling sustainability in a wider lens across the country. Again, you know, we understand we're in a race against time, and I think in terms of hopes, instead of expectations, like maybe the hope is to have like a greater collaboration among peers, right, from bank to bank, industry to industry, because there is quite a lot of data that still needs to be, you know, established. And I think this is the, you know, we can't keep reiterating this enough, because we cannot make good, achievable commitments without actually studying where we are and, you know, learning how we can get from point A to point B and get to the targets eventually. So while it's a race, I think it's something that we can achieve with, you know, either greater sharing or, again, working very closely with each other and the regulator for that enabling environment to take place. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, and certainly the peer-to-peer sharing, that's why we're here today, and we hope to facilitate this process. And while we have not gone through all the questions for today, it is the end of our panel discussion. I would like to offer my most sincere gratitude to all of the panelists here today for their wonderful sharing, and I'm certain that your insights on this subject will be greatly appreciated by our audience and our partners alike, with a positive impacts going beyond the event as well. And now, before the end of the dialogue, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Malan Apanada, Greenland Bank's convener, onto the virtual stage to give the closing remarks for the event. So Malan, the floor is yours.
Hello, Tang, and our esteemed speakers. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And my job today to conclude this webinar is to really just share the highlights of the messages and insights that we were able to gather from today's convening. The first point that was really raised prominently was the principle of proportionality that was first raised by AJ Lin. It's really about emphasizing that there's no one size fits all, and the journey that banks and other financial institutions will take on in their will be based on their size, their risk profile, as well as their internal capacity. Second one is that change will not happen overnight, but this can be expedited through top to down leadership, providing guidelines, integrating sustainability principles, as well as reforms to local laws. The third point that was raised was leading by example. For example, in the central bank, the Philippine Central Bank, it has adopted an 11-point strategy. And on your question, Tong, about prioritizing among ESG, like the trick question, it really has to be those three. But if there's a place to start, it's on the establishing the governance structure for banks and financial institutions to be able to comply. And the other points that were mentioned focuses on data and the ability to measure the risks. So data collection and the processes that banks will and financial institutions will have internally in order to be able to capture the data and measure impact will be key. And among the two final points will be emphasis on making sure that in talking about ESG considerations, the micro, medium, and small enterprises should be provided support, because this whole conversation will be based on accountability for such an existential issue as climate change. With that, we thank everyone who has joined us in today's convening, and we will make sure that you're able to access the recording, the takeaways, as well as the presentations that we will be able to secure the approval of from our speakers. So Tong, thank you for moderating today's event, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Malan, for your concluding remarks. And once again, I'd like to thank the panelists and also the audience for joining us today on this busy morning. Also, I'll not waste any of your time. It's right on 10:30. I'll leave everyone to their day, and please rest assured that we'll try our best to secure the approval of the materials from our panelists and speaker and share it to you right afterwards. So thank you and have a good day. Rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Keep safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.